Welcome everyone to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And today, on this week's Record Club, we are going to be talking about the album Starsailor by incredibly critically acclaimed musician Tim Buckley. This is Morgan's pick this week. So Morgan, why don't you tell us a little bit of background about Tim Buckley and Starsailor? You've mentioned this on the What We've Been Listening To segment on the podcast, memorably, because I remember the exact thing you said, I believe, was there was a beautiful song in the middle of this album, and then the rest of it is someone losing his damn mind with that inflection. So
yes, and it is worth noting that the beautiful song in the middle of it, roughly, is also the man losing his damn mind, but yes, it's also more
absolutely.
Anyway, Tim Buckley, noted, very popular, not necessarily popular, but very much lauded singer-songwriter, folk artist of the 70s, father of Jeff Buckley, released an album by the name of Starsailor in roughly the middle of his career. And what year was it?
1970.
Yeah.
1970. It's a thing. It's a thing that happened, and I chose this as a record club for us to do because it is utterly singular.
It's funny you mentioned that too, in the middle of us doing the 1991 retrospective, because when we get a chance to do older albums like this, I feel like we talk about, or at least can point out, the ways in which the older albums we cover are influential to a degree to like what they had spawned since, especially in terms of the retrospectives that we do. It's like, there's an obvious point of influence or something. And here it's interesting because yes, it's definitely influential on lots of different things, but also I do in fact truly struggle to see like this album is so fucking weird, man. And I know that seems like an almost facile thing to comment on, of just like, yeah, it's weird, but it's also weird in a way that like maybe two other albums I've heard in my life are weird, and it hasn't really been captured in that same way since.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about in terms of like why this album is the way it is, what is interesting about it. And who the fuck Tim Buckley even is, because yeah, he's critically acclaimed and all that sort of stuff, but a lot of the adulation that he gets has been retrospective. He died very young of I think specifically an alcohol and combined with drug overdose, and he died in a state of disrepair, obviously, but a state of downturn within his career and his life that was specifically influenced by the backlash against this album. So he had a reasonably moderately successful career as a folk rock artist in the 60s and released a string of generally beloved records that I haven't actually heard, so that's full disclosure. But I understand to be generally well regarded and to have generally at the time for him earned him a decent amount of adulation in the vein of similar artists around the time, like Van Morrison, for instance. But Buckley always had a kind of, I guess, a sense of dissatisfaction with the molds that he was kind of working within. And like a lot of artists at this time, sort of sought to push boundaries and was very inspired by a lot of the boundary pushing music that was happening in the late 60s and the fringes of rock music. It's meaningful that the band he assembled for this record include two previous members of the Mothers of Invention. And the brothers Buzz and Bunk. A lot of sense. The brothers Buzz and Bunk Gardner, who respectively play trumpet and saxophone on this record, and whose contributions are integral to the impact of a number of its pieces. So there's a lot to get into in terms of what inspired Tim here. But broadly, it gets back to his desire to, I guess, push the boundaries of rock and expand the world of what he was doing into a more progressive lane in line with what he was seeing in other forms of music at the time. Like, he was incredibly inspired by jazz musicians like Miles Davis, Eric Dolphy, Roland Kirk, who he cited as specific influences on this record. Some quotes I'm going to draw from him. The reason I like Miles and those others is because their music comes out of communication between the men playing it. Everything in rock is so over-rehearsed that when somebody hits a wrong note, they don't know what to do with it. I'll never forget listening to Roland Kirk play a wrong note, hear it, and within a split second integrate that note into the total sound and take the song somewhere else. Then the wrong note isn't a mistake, it's life. I refer to it as spiritual music, because playing music like that takes faith and trust in yourself and the people that you're playing with. And so there was a desire with a record like Starsailor to move into a more improvisational space, into a more jazz influenced space, into a more freeform avant-garde template that is, you know, clearly evident when you put this record on and here's the really sort of like formless space that a lot of these songs exist in. And it's incredibly captivating and strange. And I mean, I think one thing that can speak to the appeal of this is that despite Morgan's lack of proclivity or interest in a lot of the really esoteric rock music of the late 60s that he's heard anyway, Morgan still was incredibly taken with this record when he heard it, because there are these fundamentally compelling, simple elements that it has and that it explores in really powerful and potent ways. These are compositions that are busy, that are at times absolutely slathered in disorienting overdubs, but they never lose that sense of grounded, ghostly dreaminess that Tim puts you into in this place. And I think that you can also hear the influence of those jazz artists and of that whole style of really bucking the trend of where rock music was at in the late 60s and moving into this more sort of progressive improvisational space. And that is, again, as he says, spiritual in a sense, because it's less about the compositions themselves, which, you know, are not really nailed down in any specific way, and more about a communion between the musicians. In that sense, the progression of Tim Buckley's career and the place of this album is not dissimilar to the kind of arc and placement of Laughingstock by Talk Talk, which is a record that we reviewed last week, and occupies a similar place within its discography and a similar philosophy in terms of its approach to music as what Tim's doing here. And I've no doubt that Mark Hollis would have cited artists like Tim as an influence in that regard. And so you have these artists who are playing these, individually exercising their talents into these really unconventional rhythms. A lot of these songs are in odd time signatures. A lot of these songs shift time signatures. A lot of these songs kind of like careen into changes within themselves. You often have individual elements within a song that appear to be in a conflict with other elements in a song that's not dissimilar to things you would hear in records like Captain Beefheart albums from the time. Notable that this record was released, I believe, on the same label as a number of Beefheart's records from the early 70s. So you have that lineage there as well, which I think is really present in songs like Come Here Woman and Jungle Fire, for instance. These really kind of like brusque and affronting pieces that have this kind of like sense of groove within them that takes the lineage back to blues and stuff, but also this kind of avant-garde playing that distorts that template in really interesting ways. I mean, I love this quote from Buckley. I love how kind of like egotistical it is. He says, "I got as close to Coltrane as anyone has ever come. I even started singing in different languages, Swahili, for instance, just because it sounded better." And this gets into an interesting point about this record as well, and I'm just kind of overviewing these different aspects and we can then kind of talk about them, but the vocal aspect of this record, Tim Buckley's performance as a vocalist is so striking and singular, and I mean, at first off-putting for me. It took a long time to adjust to what he was trying to do, and he's spoken to that and the fact that his vocal stylings on this record are very pointed. An instrumentalist, in his words, an instrumentalist can be understood doing just about anything, but people are really geared for hearing only words come out of the mouth. The most shocking thing I've ever seen people come up against, besides a performer taking off his clothes, is dealing with someone who doesn't sing words. I get off on great sounding words. If I had my way, words wouldn't mean a thing. So Tim is exploring on this record, even though he writes some very poetic and striking lyricism that I'm excited to talk about as well. Even despite that, it's not even really about that. Tim is exercising and experimenting with his voice and his vocal mannerisms purely for the sake of exploring the effect of modulating your voice in all of these different ways. In a lot of respects, what Tim does with his own voice, unadorned and before the era of studio effects, is kind of analogous to what a lot of modern artists do with things like auto-tune and vocal manipulation effects to change the way that their voice comes across, to distort the way they sound and the effect of their voice. The difference being that Tim is just doing all of this just with his voice. And it's a lot to take in, obviously.
I think it's good that we preface it with that, because you have like all this information on the kind of musician that he is and what he's trying to do with this album, and then you actually put the album on with Come Here Woman, and it starts off being like this really kind of tense and almost like it's got a lot of tension in it, and it's kind of dark sounding. And then Tim just comes on here sounding like the fucking Phantom of the Opera playing this organ, and he's just like, and then the moment you understand what this album is going to be like is on the line where he goes, "Your movements you savor like a tango." Well, album just becomes so fucking vocally unhinged.
The thing that really struck me listening to this record last night is that this is, I think, one of the horniest albums I've ever heard. Like,
gosh, every single song on this album is Tim, eloquently or not, saying, "Let's have sex. I want to fuck."
Like
just down so bad.
This sounds like a man
boobs in my mouth.
This sounds like
boobs in my mouth. You're nothing.
This sounds like a man who hasn't nut in like years, and he's like got this incredible like tension within him, and
it makes him go.
And the way Morgan is singing, it's like, that's not a joke. It's actually what he sounds like. It's like,
it's actually a bit subdued.
Like my man back. Yeah, my man is down terminal on this album. Like he sounds like he's gonna die if he doesn't get.
If this guy is like aiming for Coltrane, then like his voice is going for like what Pharoah Sanders did on Ascension.
I think that's a really cool way of comparing it, because I think he is trying to do very similar things with his voice as like what a lot of free jazz musicians do with their instruments, and it is communicating this kind of like, at the heart of it, like just incredible tension and like animalistic emotion. My hideaways are longing for you.
Like, I need a little sheet.
This is me every morning on your average Tuesday.
I mean, for God's sake, the song ends with "Let me smell your thighs, mama. Let me drink down a little rain, man."
While and we're in between the lines, cold, he's just vocalizing like, "Yeah, mama." Like, I mean, he's like Eddie Vedder up in this shit, like, mama, mama, mama.
Like, it's this weird communion between like this animalistic, erotic desire and this like proximity to death and this really morbid sensibility that he has on this record as just well.
Everyone looking at him while he vocalizes and just being like, "Oh my God, what is he like?" They're just sitting there like playing the bass or whatever, and they're just like, "What in the fuck is he doing? Is he okay? Should we call a doctor?"
Well, yeah, I mean,
just like, hey!
That's the thing to appreciate as well, is that like we may think of this era as being the era of like really extreme experimentation and musicians really breaking the mold. But everyone basically reacted that way. Most people, 90% of people basically reacted the way we would still react today to hearing this record, which is just utter befuddlement. Like, people didn't know what to do with this album when it came out. It tanked Tim Buckley's career, and it sent him down a drug and alcohol-induced spiral toward his death. Like, this album is the fulcrum point of Tim Buckley's whole career and his entire life. It's this.
Could you imagine like finishing an album and being like, wow, I've gotten as close to John Coltrane as anyone's ever gotten, and then you release it and people are like
that explains why he was so, why he probably drank himself to death, is that he was on that level. And then eventually, imagine you're just like, oh, I've made, I've gotten on the level of a Love Supreme. And then fucking everyone's just like, this is fucking awful.
He was convinced this was his masterpiece, and he was utterly heartbroken when it was scathingly reviewed at the time. And it's essentially, basically, he was industry, for whatever the industry was in this era, he was essentially blacklisted for this album. Like, it's despite the fact that you have like all these other grand troops creating these tapestry like careers of this sort of thing, Tim Buckley put his whole pussy into this 35-minute exercise, and it completely ended his career. It's a really tragic story, but it also speaks to the power of this album, I guess, in a sense, like whether you respond to it positively or negatively. Like, it's something that will not, like, it will imprint itself on you. You won't forget about this anytime soon once you've listened to it.
That's the thing too, is that like you inevitably, or at least I inevitably, you think of him in relation to his at least relatively more famous son, Jeff, who with his album Grace, commonly cited as being one of the most instrumentally varied musical artists with an absolutely heavenly singing voice. In my opinion, I think Jeff Buckley is the greatest rock vocalist of all time. And you listen to an album like Grace, and it is very traditionally pretty sounding. But the thing that I found almost kind of shocking is that I found shades of Jeff's career and approach, and so far as we can judge it, on this record. And I don't know if that's a testament to Jeff following in the footsteps of his late father, or in the sense that Tim was just so hell-bent on putting everything into this record that by some eventual estimation he was going to land on to what would eventually become his son's musical career. But there are guitar tones on this album, and there are psychedelic passages on this that sound like songs right off of Grace, except filtered through a fucking crazy person who's really horny. Jeff is also horny, but very different, very traditional just kind of way of just like, oh, I'm very sad. And then fucking Tim is over here just being like, whoa! I'm very sad!
The famous traditional horny as taught in schools.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
And the thing to appreciate, and perhaps something that might be short-sighted on Tim's behalf in terms of being so surprised that this record was not immediately lavished with universal adulation, is that this is very deliberately an act of provocation as well. If you look at that album cover, right? Totally. And you consider this, even if you haven't heard his previous music, in the context of a person who has just made very sort of poetic folk rock that has definitely kind of moved outside of the realm of the traditional, but certainly not in a way that would presage something like this. And yet you have this album cover where it's just a dude and he's fucking grinning, and he's
unassuming
cocked head staring at you. He looks like he has some kind of secret that he's hiding that he doesn't want to tell you, but also at the same time he also kind of just looks like he's just hanging out too.
It's like a classically bad album cover, but it's bad in a great way.
What I love about that cover is it looks like a traditional folk 70s album cover, like someone's gone in and put it through the demon face filter just a little bit.
What I love about it as well is the only real sense of, I guess, offness that you get is that there's this kind of wash of gray in the corner of the cover that looks like it's kind of starting to eat away at the rest of the picture. And it's like it could just be this artifact, it could be something that was placed intentionally, but it's just enough to make it feel, combined with his particular expression for reasons I can't put into words, it's just enough to make it feel slightly off. Like it's just enough to make it feel like this is going for this perfect cliche cover, but it's not like it's dirty. It's also like it's kind of partially obscured. It's not like perfect.
Just a funny little man.
It has this weird eerie quality to it, this cover, and I can't tell whether that eeriness is influenced by me after the fact, knowing what the record sounds like, or whether it's just there. But there's something about it that just feels eerie looking at it, like it, and I think it's a perfect cover in that sense, because it allows you to be sucked in and subverted, but also it suggests something off. And in certain respects, it reminds me of the cover to Throbbing Gristle's 20 Jazz Funk Greats, which I think was influenced by this album cover, which is just like the band, the noise band Throbbing Gristle, just hanging out on a hill in South England. And it looks like this very pleasant album cover until you have the contextual information that the hill they're on is this famous suicide spot. And the album cover itself has these kind of like distortions in certain parts of it, or like parts where the background is kind of faded into white that just make it look a bit weird and manipulated. So it's the same sort of thing where it lulls you in, but also there's a hint that something's off. And then you put the album on and then everything completely is discombobulating as soon as you've done that. It's a great piece of bait and switch.
You know who he reminds me of sitting there, that dumbass smirk? He reminds me of Barry Keoghan in Killing of a Sacred Deer.
Wow.
Whoa.
Wow.
That's a remarkable if he doesn't play him in the inevitable biopic, then they're fucking something up, because that's genuinely kind of startling.
He's had a hex put on him where only one of his tracks can be normal, and the other ones are going to slowly like lose their ability to walk. And... It's
the result of a monkey's paw curling. It's just like I need to make an influential, really, really widely loved album, and then it's just like, and then one of them's gonna, actually it's funny that this has a cover like this, because what album kept coming to mind that I kept thinking about while listening to this that has a similarly like off-puttingly normal cover, and that being David Bowie's Self-Titled, which is not as good of an album as this by any shape of an imagination. In fact, it's pretty head and shoulders his worst. But like, it's the same thing of like Bowie was this dude who was just trying to make folk rock music when his career started out, and he made this weird vaudevillian thing that nobody liked, and it was just this album where he did all these funny little voices and all these musical ideas, and it's very evidently something that inspired, like, if he didn't listen to Starsailor, then frankly I would be astounded. But this is the kind of thing he was taking from, and similarly repeated the failure of.
Yeah, I totally agree. To get into some of the songs on this record, because I mean, I know no bones about this. I absolutely adore this album, and I adore it for more than just what it represents. I adore it because every time I listen to it, I find it more enamoring and thrilling of a listening experience. And one of my favorite tracks on here is Monterey, which is one of the most deranged songs on the whole album. I think it's a kind of...
It's when you fully get the scope of the insanity.
And reader, that means a lot.
It feels like a good distillation of where the headspace the record wants to put you in. What I love about it is that when you start listening to it, it sounds like just a Beefheart-esque piece of what you could easily mistake for blues parody the first time you hear it. Like, it sounds initially like he's doing a parody of a blues song. Like, you have this really rudimentary, almost childishly simple twanging guitar riff that plays over and over and over and over. And then Buckley is singing in this, what I would describe as a quasi yodel that sounds incredibly pained. And then you read, so it sounds like he's doing this kind of mockery of this lineage of music. And then you read the lyrics of the song, which are very akin to the poetic style of the lyrics of the rest of the record. But you realize there's a genuine darkness and a kind of abstract horror in it, in the song itself. Like the way he describes under loop of stars in the vulgar cold, the dead airport lay by the pebbles of the highway. Like he's describing this kind of ravaged post-apocalyptic landscape where he is like a wolf who is like howling, has a howl in his throat, and is like calling to his lover as this monstrous beast. And then I love the last part of the song and the lyrics in the final stanza where he says, "With my shot blood, with stains on my fingers." The way, I can't quite get that perfect, but the way he says that line is utterly unreal. And then he goes, "I run with the damned, my darling. They have taught me to laugh." Ugh, and I get fucking chills because it's just so inhuman and beastly and ugly. Like, and the way he goes vocally from like the soulful growl on that "stains on my fingers" line to literally bleeding like a sheep in the next line, it sounds like a wolf is devouring a sheep alive, and he's doing both of their voices while singing these lyrics. It's utterly animalistic and primal and disgusting, and I love it.
It's almost like proto swans in a way. Like,
yeah, I mean, it reminds me of all things of late period Scott Walker as well, who interestingly enough is an artist who came up with in a similar sort of style as Tim Buckley around the same time, but really started to push into a more avant-garde direction much later in his career. But vocally and stylistically, he, I think, owes a lot to this record as well. And it's just an utterly horrifying record, really, when you get into it. Like, it's that thing I'll keep coming back to, where it's like this combination of this primal erotic desire and this just violent, terrifying awareness of mortality. It's just so upsetting in that way.
There's also like an emotional resonance to it all too, because it's like I feel like the reason that Song to the Siren is such a standout and such a memorable moment for the people who listen to this album is because, well, I mean, like, it is a great piece of sequencing being in like the very middle of the track list. I think that that's an inspired idea, just sort of like getting through all of this. And then you arrive at this sort of like notably more sparse and kind of airy song that's like a little bit more traditional, but it's like, you're sort of mired in this kind of disgusting levels of horniness. And then you're just, then you immediately get plied with this, I mean, this longing, beautiful ballad talking about him as if he were like, the metaphor being that he's like, sort of like a not just a star sailor, like a space, like in space, but also if it was like an ocean, it's got that like psychedelic wash to it. But like there's this sort of like, I don't know, it sounds a little bit silly because of his singing voice just inherently being that way, but it's also like, it's like theater, you know, like there's an elevation to his vocal timbre here that makes it feel like also it's kind of like operatic in a weird way. I would almost describe it like that. Well, he does that a couple times on the record. Yeah.
The opera comp is fitting, I think, because it's kind of a tragic song in terms of like the narrative. Like, it's a song about
me enfold you.
A lonely sailor who is sucked in by a siren's call, and it's mulling on how like he kind of chooses to be destroyed and folded into this murderous siren out of his sort of despairing loneliness. It's just an utterly heartbreaking song.
Did I dream you dreamed about me? Damn. All right. Wasn't afraid to feel feelings in this chilly tonight. With death, my bride. You know what it makes me think of? It makes me think of Ween. I feel like this shit would show up on some shit like fucking The Mollusk, of being like this song specifically too, of just being like about, you know, a sailor who's singing about like how forlorn and like it just wouldn't be out of step with a record like that.
Yeah, maybe. I think the difference is that there's like
cover of song
that Ween would play it as a joke. Whereas, and it would be funny because they play jokes really well, in my opinion. But Tim is deadly serious. Like, this is an utterly heartbreaking song that is just basically about wanting to die, essentially, literally being down terminal from your from your loneliness, from your isolation, from your lostness.
Yeah, I think that's a big portion of the album too, and why it can be so utterly unappealing to some people, that it is this very serious, dour thing, just not presented to you in that way. You really have to do some legwork to get a lot of the intended emotions out of this album, which it's something I think he does both successfully and unsuccessfully on here, where I think, Song of the Siren is a great example of a point where he is, through the absurdity of the both instrumentation and his vocal performances, I think he's really well communicating that idea. I just find a couple of the vocal deliveries, for me at least, land a little overbearing in that desire to be so operatic and so theatrical. It kind of takes a bit of the tension and grandiosity out of it. I think he intends at points, but
that's understandable.
Yeah, it's definitely an understandable criticism.
I mean, the fact that's like that can be this is the one thing that kind of takes a little bit out of it for me. It's just like it's kind of remarkable in a way, because with an album like this, it could be one of 87 different things that makes you hate it. But like I was kind of surprised how on board I was with it for the most part, as somebody who also wasn't really feeling something like Captain Beefheart. I think the album's at its best, honestly, is when it's like almost in like proto psychedelia, where he just like these overdubs and these like vocalizations that are like in the back of the mix. Like it happens on a little bit on Song of the Siren, where it's in the back, you kind of hear this like in the background, and it's just like it's so eerie and beautiful. And like the back half of the record kind of does that a little bit more, but like when that happens and it's like really overwhelming and like really, really almost, it's atmospheric, but it's also kind of oppressive, that's when I think the album is at its best. And I like the jazz compositions and stuff and how like active and kind of spry they are, but there are some moments where it almost feels a little bit too slight, I think, where it's just like I want there to be a little bit more development on how fucking crazy this can go. And I know that like some people could probably argue it's like, oh, it's probably just the right amount to give you the amount of what he's doing. And I'm like, I feel like there are just some spaces where I feel like that maybe he could have gone a little bit farther, and that would have been cool.
What I like about it is that there's like a primal tribal feel to a lot of it, and
Jungle Fire being
Jungle Fire is one of the more animated
one of the best
moments
songs on here too. God, what a
great.
fucking good song.
That's probably one of the most animated moments in that regard, because that song really builds and builds to this like really kind of fast-paced storming thing.
Yeah.
But also like what I like about the record is that it is equal parts moments like that and moments that are kind of like more weirdly meditative, like and it's like, but they still don't lose a sense of that kind of primal tribal feeling. And so for me, it's kind of a nice balance of intensity and kind of dreamy psychedelia, I guess, on this record. And I think that in many ways, with regard to that latter aspect, the real standout and one of the most unique compositions of the fucking this whole era, like, I mean, is this title track on this record, which is it's literally just, I think it's there might be a couple of other little things mixed in there, but I'm pretty sure it's mostly just Tim's voice. And there are specifically 16 overdubs of his voice on this song. And the way that they are edited and the way that whenever he's in the front of the mix, he's interacting with and playing off of these other overdubbed versions of him that are kind of swirling around him is absolutely stunning. Like, this song is unreal. It's the most formless thing here for sure. There's no structure to this track at all. It is literally just these ghostly wails running into each other and melting into each other. And there is a sense of like intensity to all of them. and the track itself, like at points crackles with the intensity. It feels like it's going to burst apart because there's so much intense power in these vocals that are being communicated, and like the way that the seams of the mix of the song feel like they're going to cave in your headphones while you're listening to it. There's an incredible power that he summons on this track. It's really show-stopping.
I mean, it sounds cosmic in like the way that the title might suggest. It sounds like you are listening to something that is from fucking space. And it's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that aspect of it as well. And also quite meaningful that Starsailor is like a literal English translation of the word astronaut from its Greek root. So it is literally like this, duality of space and the ocean and being adrift. And it's mind-blowing. And I love that the title track sits situated between two of these most heavily tribal pieces, the other being the Healing Festival, which I absolutely love and feels like a beautiful fusion of all the various elements the record has explored up to this point. You have those careening vocal overdubs that have gotten more and more present. You have that squalling, very free jazz playing, but also quite colorful saxophone from, let me get this right, I don't want to get which Gardner brother it is. It's Bunk Gardner. You have the
good old Bunk.
You have the insistent looping groove, and then you have Tim himself stringing each syllable into twisted and contorted shapes. I think this is my favorite of Bunk's sax contributions on this record. His lines on this track are just so perfect and powerful and crazy, and I love the way that they linger in twanging dissonance, but don't just like go for pure mania for the sake of it. There's a real kind of lyrical ebb and flow to the way that he solos on this track. And then you have the other Gardner brother, Buzz, with some trumpet work on the closing track of this record as well. That is equally excellent. And I'm in love with the way in which these different instruments weave in and out of these mixes, with Tim's voice being this kind of like both central point, but also this surrounding perimeter that tightly pulls everything into the center.
I will say, I do bear a similar level of like fascination and interest in both Beefheart and what Buckley do on their respective records. I think why I may personally ultimately enjoy the Trout Mask replica a tiny bit more, not a significant amount, is I just find the totality and grandeur of that record's strangeness a little more satisfying for me. But I mean, it's kind of tit for tat, because at the end of the day, I think they're going for different enough things that the comparison isn't too terribly valid. But yeah, I will say though, I think in this record's meditative moments that we were talking about earlier, it is really exceptional and interesting.
It's just so strange too to be like, to see what kind of an album, like, I don't know, for this to be received the way it was in, like, I guess it's probably just because the areas in which Tim worked is that this was still so outside of the realms of rock and folk that it was probably seen as even more alien. But like, if it was judged as more of an exercise of free jazz, I feel like people in time would have seen it as being a little bit more ahead of its time, frankly.
And one thing I would have personally liked to see if we could have gone back and changed the history, so to speak, is we did, of course, mention Tim being part of this kind of scene of folk rocky Van Morrison types. I would love to see like the very, like, could an even more established name than Tim, like Van Morrison or someone in that niche, survive a Starsailor to their career, or was it just Tim specifically? Like, I really have to do meditate, like you say, Jake, meditate upon the factors that led to this album's initial failure.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating failure like, not in that it's a failure, but just the cultural reception to it being a failure is so strange, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it was so disheartening for Tim that he famously disbanded the ensemble on this record and then moved in towards what is described on Wikipedia as his sex funk period.
No.
Which has not been critically evaluated very positively, but is I guess a reflection of Tim having to kowtow to a certain extent. Although, you know what, I don't want to judge those records without hearing them. I'm very curious to dive into Tim's discography, and I have the feeling that Starsailor, rather than the beginning of something new, will probably play more like the culmination of his career when I have the context of the records that precede it. That's the vibe I get anyway. So I look forward to doing that deep dive in my own time, and I'll probably report on it in our What We've Been Listening To series. But even in isolation, I think, as this video can attest to, totally. Starsailor has a tremendous power that transcends its era and has put it in this position of being the universally beloved record that it is nowadays, and heavily cited for its influence. So yeah, I mean, it has to be respected for all of those factors. And also it doesn't help that it's a tight 35 minutes and it just gets in there and gets out and doesn't waste a single second. It feels like the most refined version of what it could have possibly been as well, which is something that I really appreciate about it.
Yeah, I'm nowhere near done with this thing. Like, it's obviously, we get a week to prepare for these, and you can listen to this a lot, but this is an album that I feel like properly has to really take its time to grow on me, even though I would go as far as to say I love it. I think that pretty much every piece of music here is uniformly, at least fundamentally, pretty fantastic. Just from a jazz compositional point of view, I'm really taken with pretty much everything here. If I had to pick out a personal weak point on it, just from what I've listened to of it, I would say that the track Moulin Rouge doesn't really enrapture me the same way that everything else does. But that said, it's still a very solid piece of music that features one of his more traditionally comparatively normal vocal performances.
It's a little more traditionally just pretty and outwardly immediately grabbing to I think the average listener for sure.
Which is probably why it's not my favorite personally.
Yeah, I probably agree that I'd probably agree that it's less compelling by virtue of what it surrounds, but I also appreciate its place on the record, especially coming after Monterey. And I also just think that it's a pretty solid tune as well. It's just and it's a nice little extra side of Tim that I think shows you that there's more to him than the kind of formless avant-garde that he's displaying on this record. But I can't take away from the fact that it definitely isn't the sort of thing that you reach for when you think about this album. All right. Well, I mean, I think that's probably a good place to wrap up then. Favorite tracks and ratings for Starsailor. Jake, why don't you lead us off?
Well, I would have to say that my three favorite tracks on here would have to be Song to the Siren, of course, the title track Starsailor, and of the songs I have rated a 4.5 on here, I think my favorite is Jungle Fire. So I will say Jungle Fire, and I'll say my least favorite is the aforementioned Moulin Rouge, and I will give the album an 8 out of 10.
August.
My three favorite tracks here are Come Here Woman, Monterey, and The Healing Festival. My least favorite, Moulin Rouge, and I'd give it a 6.5.
Come here, woman. Sorry, I just had to get that out of my system. That motherfucker can carry one syllable like it's 40.
Yes.
He just holds that note for so long.
Yes. He can modulate a single he can modulate a single sound as well. Like a syllable, he can turn a single syllable into a fucking array of different notes somehow without ever interrupting it. Anyway, Morgan, your favorite tracks and ratings.
I'm gonna go with favorite Song to the Siren, probably title track, and then Jungle. What was it called?
Fire. My
Jungle
three favorites. Let's go.
I wanted to say Jungle Fury, and I think that's a Power Rangers series.
That is a Power Rangers series.
Yeah.
It was the
I was gonna ask
one.
August.
Yeah.
Which series of the Japanese show is it based off, Mr.
It's
Expert?
based on Geki Ranger.
Oh damn!
Cool.
Wow.
And at any rate, my least favorite is Baz Luhrmann. Stupid. Yeah, I like that song well enough, but just of what's here, it's probably my least favorite. And I will give this an 8.5.
So from this album, I really liked Monterey. I was going to make a Rise Against joke here, but I can't remember the album name, so I'm just going to say Song to the Siren. And
Siren songs of the counterculture. Is that what you're trying to make a joke about?
That's the one. Yeah.
Us cobbling that together would have been about as funny as the joke. So
yeah,
there's really no harm done.
Please, so let's go with, I don't know, they're all crazy. I'm going to give the record a 7.5 out of 10.
My 3 favorite tracks on this record are Song to the Siren, Star Sailor. Actually, Star Sailor I might even be my favorite, to be honest, even over Siren Song. And I'll also throw in Monterey. And least favorite, it's probably Moulin Rouge. And I'm going to give the album a 9 out of 10. I fucking love this album.
Fuck yeah, love that. That's a 7.9 average, which we also gave to some rap songs, Tubular Bells, Innuendo, Saturday Night Wrist, amongst others.
Basically, the rogues gallery of albums that are off their fucking mind.
The Devin Townsend Project's Addicted, the very first Record Club record we ever reviewed, also got a 7.9. It's I've said this before and I'll say it again. It is the most cursed rating for an average rating for an album to possibly get. Anyway, let us know what Star Sailor means to you at home. Let us know what other Tim Buckley records we should check out as well. What do you think of this record? Is there anything else that we missed in our discussion that you want to add to the discussion? Hit us up in the comments below. We love to read them. Make sure you like and subscribe if you have not already, and stick around for next week's Record Club, which is going to be Saoirse's Record Club, I believe, on Neutral Milk Hotels in the aeroplane over the sea. So without further ado, August.
Rock Over London, Rock on Chicago, Victoria's Secret, A Body for Everybody.